Welcome to CPR. We have as most of you know, an occasional seminar series, and very happy to welcome Professor Dan Bodansky, who is very eminent in the field of climate law, and also an old friend who I've had the pleasure of interacting with over the years in various parts of the climate discussions. So just to briefly introduce Dan. He is the Regents Professor of Law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. And before this, he was Dean of Faculty Development and a Chair in International Law at the University of Georgia Law School. So Dan has spent more than a small amount of time in the State Department, on the other side actually being part of climate lawmaking, as a climate change coordinator and attorney advisor at the U.S. Department of State, as well as consulting for the UN in the areas of climate change, but also tobacco control. He also has been on the board of editors of the American Journal of International Law, and as you would expect, is widely published in this area, and has been recognized for his publications, most recently for this book, International Climate Change Law, co-authored with Jutta Brunei and our own Nalini Rajamani, which was awarded the, let me see if I can find this, the 2018 Certificate of Merit from the American Society of International Law as the best book in the previous year in the specialized area of international law. So Dan is widely accomplished, has spanned academics, government, and we're really privileged to catch him during his few days in India. So welcome, Dan, and thank you very much for taking the time. Look forward to hearing you tell us a little bit about COP25, a preview of what's coming up, and more broadly about the state of play global climate negotiations. Welcome.
Great. Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, to see old friends like Navroj, who I've known for more years than I would care to admit. I was supposed to be actually visiting at the center a couple of years ago, but then for health reasons was unable to. So it's a real pleasure to be able to have the opportunity to come back and speak to you today. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking about Santiago COP, the COP that's coming up in a climate conference coming up in December. And what I'm going to just briefly outline what I'm going to do, start by describing the Paris paradigm for those of you not so familiar with the climate change issue. Then discuss the recently adopted Paris Rulebook that was adopted at the last climate conference in Katowice in December 2018, and then preview the next conference coming up in Santiago in a couple of months. And what I'm going to be describing actually is based a lot on work that I did with Lavanya, and we recently published a paper on the Paris Rulebook that I'm going to be drawing from in what I'm talking about today. So just to begin with, the Paris paradigm. So I call it the Paris paradigm in contrast to the previous approaches in the climate change regime, the Kyoto paradigm and the Copenhagen paradigm. So I think the Paris paradigm really has four key elements. So the first is a bottom-up approach where countries get to nationally determine what they're going to do to reduce their emissions that contribute to climate change. So nationally determined contributions, or NDCs as it's referred to in the climate world. Secondly, transparency as the main mechanism to promote ambition and accountability in the regime. So a focus on transparency. A third, an ambition cycle to promote greater action, stronger action over time. And then fourth, a more nuanced approach to differentiation than previous approaches. So let me just briefly run through these four key elements of the Paris paradigm. So the first is bottom-up approach. So what countries do to reduce emissions, what they commit to do to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, they get to determine for themselves. They get to look at their own national priorities, national policies, to decide what they're going to do. So the type of the type of action they're going to take is very different. Some countries has emission targets, other ones don't. India's nationally determined contribution has both a intensity target element to it, but then also a policy and measures of a certain percentage of power production from non-fossil sources. So India's NDC itself illustrates the range of different types of contributions countries can be making, a different scope of NDCs, what's covered by it. So a huge range of different kinds of actions countries say they're going to do under the Paris approach. This bottom-up approach, though, is combined with a few top-down elements, internationally negotiated rules, but these only establish really soft expectations. They're not legally binding. Developed countries should take the lead by adopting economy-wide targets. Countries are supposed to, in successive NDCs, progress and have the highest possible ambition. So there's this mix, primarily bottom-up, but then also some top-down elements. The NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, are not legally binding. There's no legal obligation to achieve what you say you're going to do. It's a political pledge. And then the differentiation here is self-differentiation. Countries get to differentiate what they're doing through their choice of what their nationally determined contribution is. There's no fixed differentiation in the agreement itself. Second element is an emphasis on transparency. So transparency is really the engine that's supposed to drive what countries are doing. Countries have obligations of a procedural nature, essentially, to have transparencies. First of all, to be communicating a contribution every 5 years about what they're going to be doing over a future period. They have to provide information that makes it clear exactly what the nature of their contribution is. They have to account for their nationally determined contributions, and they have to report periodically on their progress in achieving their nationally determined contribution. So there's various procedural obligations combined with some top-down elements, some international review mechanisms. There's technical expert review. There's a peer review process, what's called the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, a mouthful, and then an implementation and compliance mechanism. Third element of the paradigm is a cycle of contributions to ratchet up ambition. So the initial contributions countries came forward with in Paris, clearly insufficient to deal with the climate change issue. So the idea is that over time, countries ratchet up their ambition. And the idea here is that every 5 years, there's a global stocktake to assess what countries are doing, whether it's enough, how it compares with what the goals of the agreement are, and then countries are supposed to come forward with a new nationally determined contribution that's informed by this stocktake. So there's regular assessments as to how the world is doing in addressing climate change that then is supposed to be informing what countries do in their next nationally determined contribution. And then the final element of the Paris paradigm is a nuanced approach to differentiation. So there's no sharp differentiation the way there was in earlier approaches. On mitigation, there's self-differentiation, as I said, of nationally determined contributions. On finance, there's still bifurcation where developed countries have to provide finance, developing countries don't. But it's a less stark differentiation than previously because now other countries, not just developed countries, are encouraged to provide financial resources. And then on transparency, there's a common system of transparency, but with flexibility for developing countries that need it in light of their capacities. So there's not a sharp differentiation developed and developing the way there was previously. There's a more nuanced approach tailored to particular issues. So a different approach for mitigation, from finance, from transparency. So I think one way of understanding the Paris paradigm is in terms of three recurring issues in the climate regime. So one issue is, to what extent does the climate regime internationally prescribe what countries are going to have to do through the negotiation of rules? And to what extent do countries get to nationally determine what they're doing through a more bottom-up approach? How much is multilaterally negotiated top-down? How much is nationally determined from the bottom up? And that's been a constant tension in the regime really since the beginning of it, back in 1991, 92. The second recurring issue is how legally binding is the regime? To what extent does the climate agreements establish legally binding commitments through a treaty? Or to what extent does it involve political commitments or recommendations, something less than a legally binding commitment? And then the final issue is the one I was just talking about, differentiation. How much differentiation is there between what countries have to do? How much is there a uniform system where countries are expected to be doing the same kinds of things? And so these are three recurring issues. And you can really understand, I think, the development of the climate change regime in terms of sort of a back and forth on these three issues. So the Kyoto Protocol is at one extreme, very top-down, internationally negotiated targets, legally binding targets, very highly differentiated between developed and developing countries. Developed countries had emissions targets, developing countries didn't. Copenhagen swung to the other extreme. The Copenhagen Accord in 2009, a very bottom-up approach, virtually no international rules that are negotiated, not legally binding, a lesser form of differentiation than Kyoto. And people have described the Paris Agreement, this Paris paradigm I described, as kind of a Goldilocks solution, sort of in between the two, a hybrid approach. So it's nationally determined, so it's bottom-up like Copenhagen, but it involves some internationally negotiated rules about transparency, which is supposed to provide some discipline in the system. So a combination of bottom-up contributions with top-down procedural rules to promote accountability and ambition. It's a treaty, so it's legally binding, but not all the provisions are legally binding. For example, your nationally determined contribution, as I said, there's no legal obligation to achieve those. So it's a combination of some legal elements and non-legal elements. And then, as I said, a more nuanced approach to differentiation. Not fully uniform, clearly, still differentiation in terms of your choice of NDCs, in terms of financial commitments, in terms of transparency flexibilities, but not the kind of sharp differentiation between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries you had in the Kyoto Protocol. So it's an in-between approach, trying to find the sweet spot that satisfies the very wide range of viewpoints that are reflected in the climate negotiations. Okay, so that's the Paris paradigm. So Paris essentially established a pretty broad framework, but a lot of the more detailed rules for how this is going to work still had to be negotiated post-Paris, and that was the negotiation of the Paris Rulebook over the last couple of years. So, for example, countries have an obligation to report on what they're doing to achieve their NDCs, the progress they're making, but exactly what kind of information do they have to put forward, when do they have to put it forward, in what form, all of that more detailed rulemaking was left to do post-Paris. And so that was the negotiation that led to the Katowice conference in December, where most elements, not all elements, but most elements of the Paris Rulebook were adopted. And really in the Paris Rulebook negotiations, I think it's important to distinguish two kinds of rules that were being negotiated post-Paris. So one was basically fleshing out, putting more detail on what countries' obligations were, what countries had to do under Paris. So what did they have to report? What kinds of information did they have to put forward when they submitted an NDC? So these are things that countries were obligated to do under Paris, but they were phrased in fairly general terms in Paris. So the question was how to elaborate those obligations in more detail. The other element of the Paris Rulebook negotiation was, I think, different. There were a lot of different international mechanisms that Paris established, and the question was how do those mechanisms work in detail? So the global stocktake, every 5 years there's supposed to be a stocktake, as I said, assessing how much progress the world is making towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement to limit temperature increase to well below 2 degrees with the aim of trying to move to 1.5 degrees if possible. So how did that global stocktake work? All of those institutional rules had to be negotiated post-Paris. Technical expert review of countries' reports. How is that technical expert review going to be organized? So two kinds of rules in the Paris Rulebook negotiations. One, elaboration of obligations parties have under the agreement. The other is elaborating the rules for how the different mechanisms Paris established would work. So I think one of the really issues post-Paris was, did Paris really reflect a meeting of the minds, or did Paris sort of get countries out of Paris able to claim agreement, but really still with the same differences still persisting? So in the Paris Rulebook negotiation, there was a question, to what extent would the rulebook essentially be an attempt to renegotiate Paris, or to what extent would the rulebook be faithful, I think, to at least what I see as being the Paris paradigm? So to what extent would it respect national determination of your contributions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? To what extent would it still be focusing on procedural obligations? To what extent would it keep the nuanced approach to differentiation that I was describing before, as opposed to the Kyoto-style differentiation, which drew a very sharp distinction between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries? And so in the elaboration of the Paris Rulebook, you still see this back and forth. These three recurring issues were still, I think, key issues in the Paris Rulebook negotiations. To what extent would there be detailed rules? How detailed would the rules be? The more detailed the rules are, the more top-down the regime is. Or to what extent would the rules be relatively not detailed, leaving countries able to decide exactly how they were going to, what their obligations were and how to what the details were about what they were going to report or what information they would provide. So how much detail versus how much left to national discretion, how binding, would the guidance in the Paris Rulebook be legal obligations on parties, or would it be merely recommendations or encouragements? And this depends on the choice of verb. Provisions might say countries may do something, so it's essentially optional. The rules might say countries should do something, so that's a recommendation, or the rules might say countries shall do something, in which case it would be an obligation. And then finally, how much differentiation would the rules have? Would there be no differentiation in many areas? Would there be some differentiation? What kind of differentiation? Would it involve the kind of bifurcation between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries in Kyoto, or something less than that? So these were the same issues that have been with the negotiations since Navroz and I first started working on this issue back in 1991 for more than a quarter century. Same issues were there during the Paris Rulebook negotiations. So I think there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether the Paris Rulebook negotiations would be successful, whether they'd actually get agreement. They did get agreement on all but one key issue, which I'll come back to, which is still open. That's the Article 6 market mechanism issue. But on the rest of the issues, they did reach agreement. Here's the Polish president of the meeting jumping over the table to celebrate the adoption of the Paris Rulebook in Katowice last November. And I think the Paris Rulebook, I don't want to go into too much detail on it, but sort of reflects the same kind of very carefully calibrated approach that we saw in the Paris Agreement. So there's a whole range of options reflected in particular provisions. So some provisions are optional with just a may, where they say, countries may do X or Y or Z, and then countries can decide which of those they want to. So the rules essentially just identify some options among which countries might choose. There's recommendations in the rule book, so some of the provisions are phrased as recommendations. Some are required, but they're self-determination, so you're required to have a nationally determined contribution, but you get to decide what that contribution is. You have to provide information, but the information is only as appropriate, and you get to decide what's appropriate. So it's required, but with self-differentiation. There's some provisions that are required, but with exemptions for particular countries to provide flexibility. There's some that are purely self-determined, but you have to say what you've self-determined. So you get to decide your own accounting rules in many respects. But a country, when it decides on what its accounting rules, has to be open about it. They can't just say, we're accounting for NDCs and it's a secret what rules we're using. They have to be transparent about what rules they've decided to use. So it's self-determined what the rules are they're going to use, but they have to be open about it. And then there's some that are differentiated. So for example, as I said, developed countries have an obligation to provide financial resources, whereas developing countries do. So we see the whole range of options reflected in different parts of the rule book. So, and the different rules really reflect exactly the calibration countries wanted to have about how mandatory or non-mandatory provision is, how bottom-up it is versus how top-down, and how differentiated and how non-differentiated. Okay, so just very quickly, a few key elements, and I'm just going to focus on two really, because I'd say although there were decisions adopted on adaptation and finance, the most contentious, or many of the most contentious issues revolved around mitigation and transparency. So on mitigation, there was proposals to elaborate the features of NDCs, what an NDC had to be. That would essentially limit the self-determined, nationally determined character of NDCs. Nothing adopted on that, so still purely self-determined, your NDCs. The only aspect in which there might be some limitations on the self-determination is the time frames for NDCs, what time period the NDCs covered. They couldn't reach agreement on time frames, but they said there would be common time frames, so they agreed to agree in the future on some internationally determined rules about what the time frames for NDCs, nationally determined contributions, would be. And then fairly detailed elaboration procedurally about what information you have to provide so that it's transparent what you're saying you're going to do, it's clear what you're doing. The procedural rules are largely legally binding, so the guidance on most of the procedural aspects of the Paris Agreement, the rule book, legally binding, but leaves considerable scope for national discretion. And then on the enhanced transparency framework, so as I said, transparency is really a key element of the Paris paradigm. It's really the engine that's supposed to provide some accountability and try to push countries towards greater ambition. So there was rules adopted about how you do your emission inventory, how you report on what your emissions are, relatively stringent. Detailed rules about how you report on progress, but it's nationally determined what your indicators of progress are. So you get to choose what your indicators of progress are towards your NDC, but you have to be transparent about what those indicators are. So you get to decide how you're going to measure progress, but you have to be open about what your approach is going to be to measuring progress. And then there's supposed to be, it's still to be determined, to be negotiated, a structured summary so that it's more clear-cut. You know, it's easier to compare different countries' reports because it will be in a structured form where you can compare apples to apples more easily. So I'd say really the heart of the Paris Rulebook is the Article 13 transparency decision, which is the longest decision in the Paris Rulebook and by far the most detailed, which has these very detailed rules about how countries report on their NDCs, what they're going to do, and also about their emissions and also about their progress towards implementing and achieving their NDCs. Much weaker, I'd say, the Paris Rulebook in terms of international review. So the technical expert review is very carefully circumscribed. The review is not supposed to make political judgments. It's not supposed to be reviewing certain key, very sensitive issues. So fairly narrowly circumscribed, strong transparency requirements about what countries have to put forward in terms of information, relatively weak review provisions, and very weak peer review provisions, the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. I think one of the most interesting features and one of the most hotly contested in the Paris Rulebook was the approach to differentiation of transparency. So to what extent would countries with the rules about transparency be the same for all countries, or to what extent would it be different for different countries? And the Paris Agreement said there'd be uniform rules, but with flexibilities for developing countries that need it in light of their capacities. So a uniform system, but with flexibility for developing countries, but not for all developing countries, only those developing countries that need it in light of their capacity. So there is differentiation, but it's fairly narrowly circumscribed here. First of all, it's only for developing countries that need it, not for all developing countries necessarily. There's flexibility only for very specific provisions. So what kind of flexibility you have. It's not just open-ended flexibility. It's specific reporting requirements about what you report, how you report it, or how frequently you report. There's very carefully defined flexibilities in the rules for developing countries that need it. A country, when it applies flexibility, has to specify the exact provision to which they're applying flexibility, so it's not just open-ended. They have to be very clear about what they're using flexibility for, and they have to provide some rationale as to what their capacity constraints are. So it's not, you get to self-determine whether you are constrained. So countries are free to say, we need flexibility for this provision, but they have to provide some rationale for why they've come to that conclusion. And they finally have to provide a time frame for improvements in their capacity. So they have to be giving a rationale. They have to be providing some time frame for the future. But bottom line is they do get to nationally determine whether they need flexibility. That cannot be reviewed. That decision by countries that their need for flexibility is final. Okay, so finally, so that was a long background as to where we are, basically, where we are in Paris, in the Paris Rulebook. So now just looking forward, prediction is not my strongest suit, so I'm better at describing what's happened than predicting what will happen in Santiago. But let me try to briefly describe what's expected, or what at least the key issues going forward in Santiago are going to be. So really, I think four key elements for Santiago that I'm going to describe in turn. So first is completing the Paris Rulebook. So as I said, most of the Paris Rulebook was adopted in Katowice last December, but one key issue still remains undecided. And so that, in theory at least, in theory at least, is supposed to be decided in Santiago, and that's the rules for the market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. The second element Santiago is going to have to be focusing on is a review of the Warsaw International Mechanism dealing with loss and damage due to climate change. So that's the second element. The third is what some people, including Chile, some of the Chileans are referring to as the Blue COP. So there's, the question is what is the effect, what is the relationship between oceans and the climate system? And how do we focus more on ocean issues in the context of the climate change regime? This has been a big issue that Chile's pushed for quite a few years. They have a coalition called Because the Ocean Coalition that they put together several years ago. And so now, as the president of the COP, I think it's likely that they will be highlighting the ocean-climate nexus, the interaction between climate and the ocean at the Santiago COP. And then finally, key issue, raising mitigation ambition. Well, I think everybody agrees the existing level of ambition countries have come forward with in their nationally determined contributions is inadequate. So the question is, how do we ratchet up ambition? How do we improve ambition? The first two of these issues, completing the Paris Rulebook and review of the Warsaw International Mechanism, those are on the agenda, so those are sort of formally part of the agenda for Santiago. The last two issues are not formally on the agenda for Santiago, but I think they're political issues that are likely to be an important aspect of the COP coming up in December. So let me go through and briefly describe these four issues for Santiago. So the first is completing the Paris Rulebook. So the Paris Rulebook established two market-based approaches. One is essentially like emissions trading under the Kyoto Protocol. Countries can internationally transfer mitigation outcomes that other countries can then use to show achieving their NDCs. So that's under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. So there's the question of how these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs, how that process is going to work. But one way of thinking about it is as something similar to the functional equivalent of emissions trading under the Kyoto Protocol. The second mechanism is the Article 6.4 mechanism, for lack of any other term that's been generally accepted. This is a project-based mechanism where countries can invest in particular mitigation projects which generate emission reductions that then can be used by another country to achieve their NDCs. So this is very much like the Clean Development Mechanism, for those of you who are familiar with the Kyoto Protocol. So ITMOs, or 6.2, is the successor to emissions trading under the Kyoto Protocol. The Article 6.4 mechanism is the successor to the Clean Development Mechanism under Kyoto. And the function of these Article 6 mechanisms, I think, is to some degree accepted, but also to some degree at issue. So one is to allow parties to reduce emissions at lower cost. So the idea of market-based approaches is countries that can reduce their emissions most cheaply are encouraged to reduce their emissions as much as possible. And then if they overachieve their target, their NDC, they can sell their emissions reductions, their excess mitigation outcomes or emission reductions to another country. And that then makes the market then directs the emission reductions to be made in whatever country the emission reduction can be made most cheaply. So it's to promote emission reductions at the lowest cost. Second is to contribute to an overall increase in global emission reductions. So this is basically, if emissions can be reduced more cheaply, then countries can be more ambitious as to what they do. So the idea is not just to reduce costs of reducing a given level, but to actually increase the overall level of global ambition that the Paris Agreement can provide. And that's an explicit part of Article 6.4, but is not explicitly part of Article 6.2, increasing overall global mitigation emissions reductions. And then the third is to contribute to support for higher ambition and adaptation. So part of the proceeds from these transfers of mitigation outcomes between countries could go to the adaptation fund and be used by countries to adapt to the effects of climate change. So The Paris Agreement has sort of skeletal provisions about Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 mechanisms, but leaves most of the details to be elaborated. So Article 6.2 says parties are obligated, if they're going to transfer mitigation outcomes, if they're going to engage in essentially emissions trading, they have to have robust accounting rules, particularly to avoid double accounting. So you can't, if you transferred an outcome and you counted it as an outcome that towards your NDC and the other country that it was transferred to also counts it, then both countries are counting the same emission reduction, and that would lead to an accounting problem. The parties are also obligated to promote sustainable development through Article 6.2 and to ensure environmental integrity and transparency. So these are obligations parties have under the Paris Agreement under Article 6.2. These are very broad obligations, and the question is, to what extent are these obligations going to be elaborated by parties collectively through rules in the Paris Rule Book, or to what extent do countries essentially get to self-determine how they apply these obligations, what they need to do to meet their obligations under Article 6.2. The CMA, the Conference of the Parties of the Paris Agreement, are authorized to develop accounting guidance. That's the only provision about what they're supposed to be doing, but if you look at the Article 6.2 guidance that's under negotiation, it goes way beyond accounting. So there's some countries like the US that object to that, saying Paris only says you're supposed to develop accounting guidance. All of this other stuff, sustainable development, transparency, environmental integrity, that's not the subject of what this Conference of the Parties is supposed to be negotiating, but other countries say, no, we want to negotiate a much broader set of rules elaborating all of these obligations that Article 6.2 provides. Article 6.4 mechanisms is supposed to aim to deliver an overall mitigation of global emissions, or as it's now referred to, OMGE, an overall mitigation of global emissions. So basically increase the overall level of emission reductions globally from what would have been the case without Article 6.4. But most of the rules for how this mechanism is going to work were left to the Conference of the Parties to develop. So a huge amount to develop in detail how this mechanism is actually going to operate in practice. So there was no agreement on these rules on either 6.2 or 6.4 in Katowice. That's the main issue in the Paris Rule Book that still needs to be resolved. It's supposed to be resolved in COP25. As I understand it, they've made almost no progress on any of the issues. So whether they're able to reach agreement at COP25, I think remains very much an open question. So just very briefly, the issues in this Article 6 discussions. So a lot relates to accounting. What will the accounting rules look like? How do you have accounting for transfers when countries are saying they're going to do very different kinds of things? So some countries are saying they're going to, in their contribution, as India does, have a certain percentage of their power generation from non-fossil sources. So exactly how does an overachievement of that get transferred to another country that can then use that ITMO, that International Transfer Mitigation Outcome, to achieve their target? So lots of accounting issues. So one is countries have different scopes for their NDCs. So some cover economy-wide all gases, others only cover certain gases or certain sectors of the economy. If you say you've achieved a mitigation outcome outside your NDC, how do you transfer that mitigation outcome? Because there's nothing you're subtracting from, it's outside. How do you know whether there's really been an increase in emissions reductions from what you were going to achieve otherwise? So there's one issue, how do you account for ITMOs from outside the scope of a party's NDC? Some countries have single-year targets, like the US says its target is simply what it's going to do in 2025. So can it be transferring overachievement of the NDC in 2023 when it doesn't actually have a nationally determined contribution for 2023 or 2024? So there's an issue about countries with single-year targets like the US as to how they're transferring emission reductions throughout their, from now through 2025. Do you average? Do you have a projection as to some kind of trajectory as to how they get to 2025 target and trade if they are under their trajectory? How is that going to work? Some parties have non-emission-based NDCs like renewables targets. what would an ITMO look like for those where you can say you've reduced your emissions by some, there's not some specific amount of emissions reduction that you've overachieved your target by. And then finally, there's NDC, could be transfers for purposes other than another country achieving their NDC. So the big issue here is the International Civil Aviation Organization now has a system where they're going to require airlines to have credits so that airlines' emissions growth post-2020 is carbon neutral. So they have to offset all of their emissions growth above 2020. So airlines may be buying emission reductions from countries that overachieve their NDC. So the ITMOs are now being transferred out of the Paris system altogether. And how do you account for those emission reductions? How do you ensure that some airline, Air India is not counting that emission reduction, but then the other countries also shouldn't be counting that emission reduction, because otherwise there'd be no net benefit to the climate system. Okay, so a whole series of accounting issues. There's also a series of political issues under the Article 6 rules. So should the idea that some of the proceeds from trading, from these market-based transactions, should some of the proceeds go to adaptation, to the adaptation fund? The Paris Agreement says there will be money going from the Article 6.4 mechanism for adaptation. It doesn't say that any money from Article 6.2 transactions goes to the adaptation fund. But some countries are saying, no, the share of the proceeds, as it's called, share of the proceeds from market transactions should apply not only to Article 6.4, which the Paris Agreement provides for, but should also apply to Article 6.2 transactions. There's also the issue of the relationship of Article 6.4 and 6.2. And there's also an issue about transition from Kyoto. So what happens to all the Kyoto units under the Clean Development Mechanism? Do they get grandfathered into the Paris system or not? Projects that were established that are generating emission reductions into the future, do those emission reductions get counted, or do they have to go through a process? So lots of issues. If you don't understand what I just said, you're in good company, because I'm told that most heads of delegations of the climate negotiations show a lack of detailed appreciation of these issues too. That's one of the problems, is the rules are quite complicated, and just trying to figure out what these issues are and what the different options for addressing them are very complicated. And I think there's, even though we're only 2 months away from supposedly the rules being adopted, there are very few people who have a very good technical understanding as to what the different options are for actually resolving these issues, let alone trying to get political agreement as to what the resolution should be. So they're both technical problems in just understanding what the different rules might be, and then political issues about what the choice of different options might be. Okay, so very likely, or very possible, certainly well within the realm of possibility, that there won't be Article 6 rules that are adopted. This, I think, has different implications for Article 6.4 and 6.2. Article 6.4 can't operate without rules, because without rules, there is no 6.4 mechanism. You need to know how it works. So if there are no 6.4 rules adopted, the 6.4 mechanism won't be off the ground. It's not going to get up and running until rules are adopted. Article 6.2, though, I think is different, because Article 6.2 doesn't depend necessarily on international rules being agreed. Article 6.2 is essentially self-contained. It says parties shall do, can transfer mitigation outcomes so long as they meet certain obligations. In the absence of rules, parties could go ahead and say, we are meeting our obligations to avoid double counting, to promote sustainable development, to ensure environmental integrity and transparency. We're meeting those obligations, and there's nothing in Article 6.2 that says we can't go ahead and start trading even if no rules are adopted internationally. There's nothing saying you can only trade if rules are adopted. It simply says you can trade so long as you meet these requirements. And so if a country says it's meeting those requirements, it could go ahead and say it's going to trade. There's now quite a lot of discussion among countries that want to do trading, of which there are quite a few. I think over 70 more NDCs actually provide for some trading as a means of achieving their NDCs. There's quite a lot of talk about having clubs of countries essentially establishing their own rules under which they would trade between. And so long as they say their own rules are consistent with the Article 6.2 requirements, they would then go ahead and trade, saying, we are going to use the accounting rules we've decided among ourselves. So if there are no Article 6.2 rules that are adopted in Santiago, I think there's a reasonable possibility some countries will say, okay, these are the rules of the whole range of options of rules that are being discussed. These are the rules we like. We're going to adopt them among ourselves and say that's how we're going to be implementing Article 6.2. Okay, let me try to speed up because I'm running out of time. So review of the Warsaw International Mechanism. So this is the mechanism to address loss and damage associated with climate impacts. And there are two kinds of impacts. There's slow onset events like sea level rise, desertification, and acidification. So these are things that are impacts that take a long time to develop. So how do you address the loss and damage from those impacts like desertification, sea level rise, and acidification of the oceans? And then there are also extreme weather events like hurricanes, heat waves, and floods. How do you address the loss and damage from these sudden onset, these extreme weather events? So the Warsaw International Mechanism was established in 2013 by COP19, by the 19th Conference of the Parties. It's governed by an executive committee. Basically, no agreement that it would provide funding, that it would provide any compensation. It's essentially to enhance knowledge. It's to strengthen dialogue and cooperation, coordination. It's to enhance action. It plays a facilitative role to try to better understand how to address loss and damage and to strengthen dialogue and coordination. So that was basically huge political differences about what the mechanism should look like. This was all that was able to be agreed to in Warsaw when the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, was established. There have been, under the Paris Agreement, the WIM is subject to the authority of the Paris Conference of the Parties. So Article 8 of the Paris Agreement says that the Warsaw International Mechanism is subject to the authority of the Paris Agreement Conference of the Parties. And there have been one review already of the WIM in 2016, and the next review is the one coming up in Santiago. And just quickly, the terms of reference for the review were adopted in June. The objectives are very broad: to progress on implementation of the work plan, to review the long-term vision, essentially blah, blah, blah kinds of objectives. But the key issues, I think, in the review, really two key issues. One is governance. The WIM was established by the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention parties. The Paris Agreement says it's subject to the Paris Agreement parties. There's largely overlap between Paris Agreement parties and UN Framework Convention parties, but not total overlap. If the US withdraws from Paris, then there will be less overlap. So the question is it governed by just the Paris parties, or is it governed by both the Paris parties and the Framework Convention parties? So whose authority is it subject to? Which institutional body, which conference of the parties is ultimately able to govern the WIM? Is it both? Is it just Paris? What's the answer? And then the other is, what is the substantive role of the WIM? Is it simply coordination, enhancing understanding, or does it have broader functions, in particular, raising finance to address loss and damage? So is it just a coordination, knowledge-based function, or does it also have a financial function? All right, so the third issue, climate change in the ocean. So oceans play a central role in moderating climate change, both by absorbing the heat and by absorbing carbon dioxide. There was just a big report the IPCC came out with on oceans and the cryosphere and climate change. So the issue about the relation of oceans and climate change is really front and center on the agenda at the moment. Climate change is going to have huge impacts on the oceans, including on baselines, maritime zones, flooding, coastal areas generally, displacement of people. I'm not going to go through this for lack of time, but I'd be happy to answer questions. The question is, how do you integrate the ocean more closely into the climate change regime? What can the climate change regime do about the oceans, or how can the oceans help the climate change regime? And so I think here, of course, like everything else, there's a mitigation angle and an adaptation angle. But I think one of the things that a lot of countries are pushing is that there's ocean-based mitigation potential that's untapped. There's potential to mitigate climate change, to reduce net emissions to the atmosphere through ocean-based activities. And so this is sometimes called blue carbon. So carbon is absorbed into ocean ecosystems. So an emphasis on trying to get countries to better integrate ocean-based mitigation into their NDCs. And the other is ocean adaptation, and particularly ocean adaptation beyond national jurisdiction. So countries can provide for adaptation to climate change in their coastal areas, but the question is also impacts of climate change on areas beyond national jurisdiction. Are there things you might be able to do that would help the ocean adapt better to climate change beyond coastal areas? So Chile has called Santiago COP25 the Blue COP. And so the question is what they're going to do. And I think there are two possibilities for how they might try to emphasize ocean issues. So one might be to develop a platform for ocean-related activities. So there's some institutional platform that can provide an umbrella for countries that want to go forward with ocean-based climate activities. The other is to focus at a high level on the recent IPCC report on oceans and the cryosphere to try to give greater political visibility, higher level attention to the ocean climate nexus. So those are two ideas, I think, for how Chile might try to emphasize the ocean climate issue at the Santiago COP. And then finally, raising ambition. Global progress is stalling and reducing emissions. So this is just showing some of the different indicators about emissions, fossil fuels, installation of renewable energy. So the goal of Paris is to keep temperature increase to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So that's the goal of Paris. There's also an emissions goal to have a global peaking of emissions as soon as possible and to return to net zero emissions in the second half of this century. So we're falling well short of those goals, So how do we increase ambition? This is just showing current NDCs. This is evaluated by Climate Action Tracker, which is an NGO that tries to track NDCs, showing which NDCs that parties have already put forward, how they do against the goals of Paris, the well below 2 degree goal, the 1.5 degree goal. So it goes from critically insufficient, so way short. U.S., I hate to say, is in that category and may even fall further to the left given the rollback of federal policies under the Trump administration. Highly insufficient, and then compatible. And India is, according to Climate Action Tracker, its NDC is in the compatible range with a well below 2 degree target, not enough for a 1.5 degree target. So this is just trying to evaluate the current NDCs. As I said, the idea is to, over time, raise ambition, and what needs to be done, according to the IPCC, is that global emissions must decline by about 45% by 2030. From 2010 levels, they need to reach net zero emissions by 2050, so a huge task in the next 30 years to get to net zero emissions. As I said, there's this ambition cycle the Paris Agreement sets up that's supposed to encourage higher ambition over time. So countries have to report, there's a stock take, and then a new round of NDCs on this 5-year cycle. And over time, this is supposed to lead to a progressive ratcheting up of ambition. And this is just a schematic showing the hope, at least, of what Paris is going to achieve. That in each of these 5-year cycles, there's the global stock take, the new NDCs, and that's going to lead to an overall increase in ambition, putting us back into a range that will achieve the well below 2 degree target. So one of the main purposes of the recent UN Climate Summit in New York was to raise ambition. I guess Navroz was very heavily involved in that conference as part of the Scientific Advisory Committee. But the UN Secretary General convened the conference, the summit, in order to try to put pressure on countries to come forward with higher ambition in their NDCs. Countries are going to be coming forward with new NDCs in 2020, so this coming year. So the idea was to try to create some political momentum so that countries come forward with stronger NDCs in the next round this coming year. I think the results of the summit, in my view, and I think the view of many observers, pretty disappointing in this respect. A lot of countries did announce they would enhance their NDCs, but they make up a relatively small share of global emissions. I think half of the countries that said they would enhance their NDCs are small island developing states who account for have a very strong interest in reducing emissions, dealing with climate change, but have a very low impact themselves on the climate. Quite a few countries pledged they would get to net zero by mid-century. Significant, I think the summit was stronger on financial support. So significant pledges of financial support to the Green Climate Fund. U.S. has pulled out of the Green Climate Fund, so a lot of countries, European countries, have stepped up their efforts. A number of them said they would double their contributions to the Green Climate Fund that in large part make up for the absence of the U.S. going forward. So significant pledges of financial support. I think where observers thought there was the most progress, the most encouraging signs out of New York summit were not the country commitments, but the commitments by non-state actors, subnational actors, private actors. So there were pledges, for example, by insurance companies and pension funds to divest from fossil fuel-based companies by 2050. A number of banks, quite a few big banks, said they would align their lending practices in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. A number of countries and companies together pledged to end reliance on coal. So long list of initiatives that were announced in New York that if they're actually implemented and achieved would actually be significant. Whether they will be implemented and achieved, of course, is an open question. I think one of the ideas of the Secretary General coming out of the summit is to establish some process to monitor what's going on with these initiatives so that there's some accountability. You know, as countries, there have been a lot of different actors who've pledged to do things in New York, but whether they actually live up and perform their pledges, open question, and to try to set up something more institutionally going forward to try to assess whether the pledges have been actually achieved or not. So finally, just task for Santiago on this. So the question really for Chile, for countries generally, is how to use the Santiago conference to motivate leaders to enhance ambition. This is not something explicitly on the agenda, but I think it's what many people hope will be the biggest result coming out of Santiago. How do you get countries to come forward? You know, to what extent will Santiago put pressure on countries to announce significant enhancements of their NDCs? To what extent will it encourage countries to develop a vision for how do they get to net zero emissions by 2050? So to what extent do they have new NDCs, long-term strategies? This is, I think, going to be the ultimate test for how successful Santiago is, and so very much open question on that. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, I went a little over on my time, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. So I think we have a really comprehensive roadmap of where we've come from and a set of possibilities about where we might get to in the next couple of months. So with that, open for questions. Maybe we'll collect a few questions together and then hand the mic back to Dan. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. You have told us about the Paris COP, Paris, the incoming Santiago. So the mechanism and the techniques in which we have to undergo. But my question is that, the countries like Bangladesh, Philippines, those who are in the coastal belt, and they are very much, likely to be drowned by the climate change. How far we have been helping international organizations or climate change has been helping these islands or the countries? Is there any, figure whether we are getting some help, like Sri Lanka or any other countries, where they are in the, likely in a danger state? So we have not found any details about that. So that is very important to us.
My question, I think I'm loud enough. Thank you so much. Apologies if I ask some very basic questions. It's a very new subject for me. I'm Urvashi. I'm from an international NGO called Practical Action. I'm the Water, Sanitation, Hygiene Advisor. And there are three areas which I find real direct link with what you're doing, exemplary work. One is on work on renewable energy and waste out of wind. So there's a huge momentum in the country with Swachh Bharat Mission on greenhouse gas emission reduction through conversion of solid and liquid waste. And we have a project in the eastern part of the country and support what Sir has just said in two areas. We work in the eastern part of the country, Odisha, which has gone through disasters. Odisha and West Bengal every 3 months, I think, and the frequency is increasing. There are two questions specifically. How does this Paris Agreement or Santiago Agreement impact organizations like ours who are doing very small innovative projects in reducing these greenhouse emissions in terms of the finances that will entail, and also the trading, the technologies involved in this? Because a lot of these organizations are today struggling in India to sustain these innovations. So I just want to know from a grassroots perspective that these negotiations international national level, how would it help in supporting such innovative projects in the country?
Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. My name is Kaveri. I'm a postdoc at the Harvard Kennedy School. And so my question is about the mechanism akin to the emissions trading mechanism that you described. What are the possible things that can go wrong so I think of the emissions trading mechanism in Europe, and one consistent problem has been that the price that has been discovered has been much lower than what was expected. Do you think such issues might come up again? What could go wrong with this?
So, I'd say lots can go wrong with the emissions trading system. So the European system or the Kyoto system is one where there are fewer accounting issues because under Kyoto, for example, countries have fixed targets. Their targets are all the same. They're economy-wide, dealing with the same gases. So even in a system where it's very easy to account for emissions trading, where you can actually, there are serialized numbers for each assigned amount unit that then get transferred and they get deducted from the selling country's account and get added to the other country's account. Even where there are no accounting issues, there are problems, as you mentioned. I'd say the problems, though, are much, much greater under the Paris Agreement and the potential for abuse under the Paris Agreement because it's very unclear how the accounting is going to work when countries have very, very different kinds of targets in terms of what sectors are covered, what gases are covered, whether it's an emissions intensity target versus a fixed target, a single year target versus a multiple year target. So you have this extreme heterogeneity of different kinds of NDCs. And so the question is, so in addition to the kinds of problems you mentioned, which Paris doesn't address, you have this huge initial accounting problem to ensure that the system isn't used to basically water down NDCs. I mean, the idea of Paris is countries get to decide what they're going to do. The NDCs may be insufficient, but at least they have to be upfront about what they say they're going to do so they can be criticized if their NDC is not very good, or if they haven't achieved their NDC. There's no penalty, it's not legally obliged, but you have to be upfront. Now, if you can hide all that by trading, where you say you're buying an emission ITMO, an emissions a transferred mitigation outcome from another country that doesn't, where they're counting it and you're counting it, then you lose the transparency about whether countries are actually doing what they say they're going to do. So then the way that Paris is supposed to work through transparency, in fact, whether the transparency will be enough is an open question by itself. But if there's no transparency, if countries can hide what they're doing through double counting, through lax accounting rules, then you don't even have transparency to begin with. So I think there are huge issues, in addition to the kinds of issues you raised, that Paris involves, that is what countries are now struggling with. In theory, if there are no rules, countries are supposed to be having rigorous accounting. They're supposed to be transparent about what their accounting rules are. But whether that's going to be enough, I think, is highly debatable. On the questions about finance, either for mitigation or adaptation, this has been one of the key issues throughout the climate negotiations is not just about what countries are going to do to reduce emissions, but how much countries are going to be providing financial resources, technology resources to assist other countries either to mitigate or adapt to climate change. I would say the big trade-off in Copenhagen was that developing countries for the first time in Copenhagen agreed to take on, to make international pledges about what they were going to do to reduce emissions. So Copenhagen, unlike Kyoto, involved pledges by most countries in the world, representing the vast majority of global emissions. Developing countries said they'd make pledges in return for the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to be providing finance for both mitigation and adaptation and roughly equally. And developed countries said they would mobilize $100 billion of finance, not necessarily from their own public sources, but total. So that was the trade-off, that developing countries said they would be willing to make international pledges about what they were doing to reduce emissions of some kind. That's carried forward in the idea of NDCs in Paris, in exchange for a significant ratcheting up of financial assistance, both for countries that are severely impacted by climate change or for the kinds of projects to mitigate emissions in developing countries, including through transfers of technology. I'd say there's been a lot of dissatisfaction among developing countries for whether that side of the bargain was really upheld, whether it's very difficult to actually determine the amount of climate finance that's been mobilized, because it's very difficult to actually define exactly what counts as climate finance. But I'd say that's been, in my view at least, it's not an area I've specialized on, so others may be much more familiar with it, and feel free to pipe in on this issue. But my sense is the amount of money actually being transferred is modest. The Green Climate Fund, which was established under Copenhagen, has taken a long time to get up and running. The amount of actual money being transferred in the pipeline is small. It's still relatively small. It's being ramped up. But in theory, yes, in theory, Paris is supposed to be both providing a technology mechanism that's supposed to be looking at barriers to technology transfer, that's supposed to be trying to do capacity building to create an environment in which technology can be transferred more effectively to developing countries. So there's a technology mechanism aspect to the Paris Agreement, and there's also a financial aspect to the Paris Agreement to provide the financial support for that technology. So there's definitely provisions in there. How well they're being implemented, how much effect, you would know better than I do, how much effect they have on the ground, because unless they're translated in a way that actually affects people on the ground trying to do the projects, then they're more or less words on paper. So the question is how much translation there is. Finance for, an even bigger issue than finance for mitigation is finance for adaptation and loss and damage for countries that are severely impacted by climate change, like Bangladesh. This has been an issue since '91. in Paris, in Paris, the Paris Agreement recognizes the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, but in exchange, the U.S. extracted a provision saying the Paris Agreement provides no basis for liability or compensation for loss and damage. So there's an explicit ruling out of any liability or compensation for damage. Now, the question is, could there be, since the Warsaw International Mechanism was established under the Framework Convention, the question is, could there be liability and compensation under the Framework Convention, even if not under the Paris Agreement's Article 8? That's been, I think, a persistent issue that's actually part of the Warsaw International Mechanism review that's going to be in Santiago, is to what extent was the provision in the Paris decision that said no liability or compensation, there's no recognition, how much of that carries over to the Framework Convention. Interestingly, in the ratification documents for the Framework Convention and for, I think, Paris, a number of states, particularly small island developing states, had an explicit understanding in their instrument of ratification, basically reserving their right to make claims for liability and compensation, that nothing they did in joining limited their ability to pursue otherwise pursue under international law claims for liability and compensation. So this has been, I'd say one of the biggest political issues in the negotiations. The loss and damage caused by climate changes, could be astronomical in size, and so developed countries have been, very resistant to any suggestion that they're on the hook to provide compensation for those very high damages.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Shivani?
Thank you so much, Professor Bodansky. My question is that you've been a very keen, close observer of how the international regime around UNFCCC has developed over the last almost 3 decades. Just curious, personally, what is your level of confidence in the international regime to meet the challenge, as opposed to the non-state actors or within the national frameworks? Where would you place your confidence in?
Well, can I just
I was raising my hand to ask the question. You can just
Can I just briefly follow on to the question? I had sort of a similar question to put. Maybe I can just sort of elaborate on it and ask. I think the promise, as you said, Paris is this kind of Goldilocks middle ground, supposed to be, and there was 2 hopes I think in Paris. One was that through a process of, in part, naming and shaming, and through sort of a international peer pressure, you would get some sort of virtuous cycle. And given that we have some notable opt-outs from that virtuous cycle, it's really, how successful is that international mechanism going to be? But then the second mechanism is that the Paris Agreement would put in place all these procedural obligations that then might spur conversations domestically within countries like India, and we have some colleagues here from the ministry as well. And speaking personally, you see that there have been conversations happening in India that weren't happening earlier, and I don't know enough about other countries, but there's sort of 2 pathways, in a sense, for the Paris Agreement to have an action, and welcome your comment on both of those. So maybe you could just reflect on these 2 questions, and we'll do another
Okay.
round.
Sure. So I just came from a conference in Singapore where I was speaking, where somebody afterwards said, "You're so optimistic," and I said, really? Nobody's really accused me of being very optimistic about the Framework Convention process before, so I was quite surprised. But I think it's hard to have been involved in the process for as long as I have, and feel that the process is a very good process. It often seems the progress is extremely halting. It's extremely tortuous, considering the urgency of the climate change problem and the need for rapid action. The pace of the negotiations is extremely slow, is glacial, to use a climate term. So no, I don't think it's not terribly optimistic about the process. A former executive secretary of the UNFCCC once told me that if you assembled all of the Nobel Prize winners in the world, they couldn't come up with a worse process than the UNFCCC with all their brain power. And this is the executive secretary of the UNFCCC. I won't say who. No, it's a considering the magnitude of the issue, I think the process is really not adequate to the problem, to deal with the problem. Now, the question is, can you develop a better process? And I think it's hard to really see exactly how, because I think the process reflects the fact that a lot of countries don't want to do much on climate change, or if countries have very, very different positions on climate change. So given that, it's not just that the process, could be better if it isn't. It is what it is because of countries' positions on climate change. I think given that, Paris was about as good as could possibly be achieved. If you sort of looked at what was politically achievable, the range, they did about as well as possible given the range of country positions going into Paris. Now, that said, it's as good as possible, but likely not to be good enough to deal with the problem. Now, Paris, as Devroge just mentioned, is based on this idea of peer pressure and a virtuous cycle, creating essentially political moments every 5 years, like before Paris, that will put pressure on countries to come forward with stronger commitments over time. And that there'll be this repetitive cycle where there'll be a virtuous cycle of progressively higher ambition, and it will spur, as Devroge said, internal conversations, because there'll be your leaders going to the conference has to come forward with something, and so that then puts everybody's feet to the fire to try to figure out, what can you do to address climate change so that you don't look bad in the next cycle, in the cycle coming up. So that's the theory. I think it's a completely untested theory. We've only really had one cycle so far, which was Paris. I think Paris, at least most assessments say Paris was a big improvement over business as usual. So actually, the idea that if you have a political moment that really focuses attention on the problem, that gets very, very high level attention, countries will in fact go back and look and say, what can we do more to address climate change so they don't look bad. So I think worked to some degree in Paris, not enough obviously, but it worked to some degree. Whether every 5 years you can be successful in creating that political moment, whether that is going to be sufficient to overcome domestic obstacles, these are all completely untested questions. We have no idea what the answer to them is. I don't think we'll really have an idea until 2023 or 2028 in the next cycles. So far the indicators are not that great because not that many countries have actually come forward with significant enhancements at their NDCs. Under Paris, they don't really have to in 2020, but in the next cycle, in 2023 to 2025, if they still don't really do much, at that point, I think the verdict will be in on Paris, but hopefully the verdict will be positive, but I think it's an open question whether it will be. So I do think there's at least a theory under which Paris could work. Every 5 years, there's an assessment, attention's focused on the issue, there's a very high level attention that spurs internal dialogue, discussion, countries are forced to try to put their best foot forward and make progress over time. So there's a theory under which Paris could work, but I think that theory is completely untested still.
Great, thank you. Sorry to keep you waiting. Your question, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an insightful talk. I'm a doctoral candidate in Jawaharlal Nehru University. So basically, I'm working on climate change negotiations with theoretical aspects of considering the theoretical aspects of multilateral conference diplomacy. So as like I have gone through your articles, I want to go a little back. I want to go to the Copenhagen. So many of the scholars consider Copenhagen as the Copenhagen Accord as kind of political makeup, as they wanted to save their image, so they came up with the accord. but you have written an article which says that it was a significant move. So I was curious to ask how you, as there is no even institutional framework for Copenhagen Accord, but still you have seen a positive, there is your optimism very much visible, considering it as a significant move. And another question concerning the Paris negotiation round. So how do you see the growing diversity of international actors vis-a-vis like INGOs, ENGOs, civil society organizations, and also you had a picture of Greta. So how much pressure all these non-state actors are putting? Yeah, so how do you see, how will these actors influence the upcoming negotiations? Thank you.
Okay, no, we'll take 2 or 3 questions together. So
Because this seems to be a bunch of questions.
Okay, I can try to answer the, I can,
Very good. Very good. Too many
so
questions.
let me just, so we have Dr. Park, we have Parthu, we have Monish, we have somebody back there. So Parthu, why don't you go with your question?
I think I'll pick on where. So it's not just non-state actors, right? There's also sub-state actors who are now becoming, especially in the US, becoming much more vocal and visible, effective in the question. But I want to ask your opinion as a lawyer. If the national state decides to impose its rules on a sub-state which is trying to abide by the convention, does the sub-state have recourse to international law in order to not take on, sort of act as a national state is asking it to act? So if it's, for example, California wants to have a higher emission story on its cars, and they are mileage requirement for its cars, and the national government says, nonsense, you're not allowed to do that. Do these international treaties provide California with any ammunition for defending itself against federal action?
Mine is just to thank you. But if somebody wants to.
Okay, let's take Manish is talking. He's talking to David.
Thank you, Professor Bodansky. It was really interesting. And my name is Manish. I teach climate policy at Delhi School of Advanced Studies. So personally, for me, it was a good learning to see how a politically cumbersome agenda can be presented, and in a very technical way, stripping down most of its political complications. So it was really interesting learning as a teacher for me. I have a couple of questions, but I will just ask 2. One is the way I see NDCs is it's really a moving target. If you are revising it every 5 years, then you can always shift the goalpost timeline. And in fact, the real substance of impact really lies, in my view, in the ability of individual countries to implement their current targets or part of it, and in such a way that they move on to a higher learning curve. Because unless that happens, I don't see the revision really taking any momentum. So how do you see this question of implementation capability of countries as a barrier to the success of the Paris regime itself, particularly given the context of last 10 years, and as the forecasts also go that the global economy and the major economies are going through very peculiar economic uncertainties. That's one. And the second question is related to the role of non-state actors. You pointed out that the commitments that are coming from corporates are really kind of a silver lining sort of thing. But I want to think about the role of corporates in relation to the question of climate finance. The demand for public finance from developed countries has been a very long-standing demand, and it hasn't really been accepted by developed countries. And one reason is that, and it's increasingly becoming evident, is that the fiscal capacities of many countries is getting limited because the multinational corporations are really not paying their taxes. Recently, the OECD has recognized it, and they are trying to come up with international regime how to develop a new tax regime to increase tax collections from multinational corporations. And it's significantly large number of countries have become part of BEPS. So would your optimism extend to the degree that the corporates would accept the new possible global, if it becomes a treaty or law for tax collection?
Very interesting. One last question behind you there.
One of my questions is related to some other questions that was asked already. One is that like the natural resources like Amazon rainforest is owned by what country? If it is owned by Brazil, then are the other countries right in imposing some other sanctions if its national objectives are not allowing Brazil itself to come up with, because it rejected the help that G7 countries were the aid which they were providing with. So the national objectives of the country Brazil were an obstruction in following the climate policies or the actions, taking climate actions. So how does this Paris Agreement deal with these type of situations where countries' national objectives are an obstruction when they are coming in relation to their climate policies or actions? And is it right for other countries in the world to impose sanctions or take actions or pressurize a country to follow such actions for climate or like positive climate aspects?
Why don't you take this round? It's quite a few. We have a lightning round at the end, but then we need to start moving towards the wrap-up.
Okay. Well, all excellent questions. So let me try to run through them quickly if I remember them all. So Copenhagen, I think Copenhagen does get a bad rap, so to speak. It's first of all, it wasn't really run so differently from other climate conferences. So the claims that it was undemocratic and procedurally deficient, I think, has been true of almost every climate conference before Copenhagen and after Copenhagen. So I don't think it was that different from other ones. It was just more visible and the stakes were higher. I think it was a significant outcome because it really, what I describe as the Paris paradigm, really largely comes out of Copenhagen. So you can either like it, the paradigm, or not like the paradigm. I think it's the best countries are likely to agree to, but it may be insufficient. So I think they're both pluses and minuses to the paradigm. But I think the Paris paradigm really is largely taking the Copenhagen paradigm and adding some greater rules to provide greater discipline, because the problem with the Copenhagen Agreement was there really weren't almost any international rules. So countries' pledges were very undisciplined. At least in theory, the Paris Agreement will provide greater discipline, but it really leaves in place the whole idea of nationally determined contributions. Transparency is the way to promote better accountability and ambition and so forth. So that's why I think Copenhagen was a significant outcome. On non-state and subnational actors, a whole series of questions relating to them. So I think subnational or non-state actors can influence the climate policy in two ways. So one is they can influence national policies. So if the youth movement or other movements are successful in actually changing election results, then national policies will change. So far, climate has not really been successful in changing national elections. The Australian election last year, was considered largely to be, climate was a very big issue, and the party that was in favor of stronger climate action lost. So far, the activism by non-state actors hasn't been successful in actually getting an electoral victory. I think that would be, though, if there's enough momentum generated, youth movement, other changes, if they actually changed the election, then I think that would be huge. I'm told that most U.S. environmental foundations and funders are no longer funding work on the climate negotiations. They're funding work to try to change the election results in 2020 because they think, the most important thing they could do to affect the climate is to have the election turn out differently in 2020, not to fund climate-specific action. So the same is true, I think, of non-state activists. If they can wield sufficient power to change election result, that would be huge. The other is to do things directly, and that includes both non-state actors and subnational actors like California. And there's a huge initiative among cities to try to do things. So to the extent subnational or non-state actors are, can undertake initiatives on their own, that can make a huge difference. For example, some of the action that promotes sustainable forestry has come about through consumer pressure. To the extent there's divestment from fossil fuel based companies, that will exert financial pressure. So there's a lot of things that non-state actors and subnational actors can do through essentially direct action or initiatives that can have potentially a big impact over time. So I think that would be the other sort of pathway by which non-state actors can have an effect. The climate regime is increasingly, I think, receptive to the idea that they should be looking at initiatives by non-state actors. That was a big emphasis of the climate summit, as I mentioned. There's now a process to try to promote climate action by non-state actors. I was told that the Costa Rica pre-COP for Santiago was the first pre-COP, first climate meeting where it was completely open to non-state actors, in recognition of the important role non-state actors can play in dealing with climate change. So I think there's greater receptivity, at least in theory, to, and greater encouragement of direct action by non-state actors. But, I think ultimately government policy is going to be necessary. So unless you can change elections and get government policy changed, it's not going to be enough just to rely purely on bottom-up grassroots kinds of activism. So could California rely on, so can a subnational actor rely on the international law, climate law, to resist efforts to curb their activities by the state? So I think there's both a national law issue and an international law issue. So the national law issue is going to vary from country to country as to, what is the role of international law within the national legal system. In the U.S. system, I think it would be impossible for California to raise as an argument against the Trump administration, the Paris Agreement, or international law generally, because international law doesn't have sufficient status in U.S. domestic law to be able to curb what the national government does. In fact, one of the big arguments that opponents of Paris made about why Trump should pull out of Paris was fear that Paris might be used in litigation to limit what the federal government could do. And most supporters of Paris said, well, that's not a reason to pull out of Paris because Paris isn't going to have any effect anyway in domestic law. And I think that's accurate. It may be different in other countries. So it may be in other countries, international law has sufficient status in domestic law that it might actually impose some limits on what the national government can do. That's an issue I don't, it depends on national law, and I'm not sufficiently familiar with different national legal systems to answer that generally. Would international law impose any limits on what a state can do to curb subnational action? Well, there I think the answer is pretty clearly no. First of all, international law creates rights and obligations primarily for states, so it's not creating rights for subnational actors against their state. International law is very respectful of state sovereignty, so I think for a variety of reasons, it would be very hard to maintain that international law would impose a limit on what national governments can do vis-a-vis their constituent units. With corporations, I think it's my optimism, such as it is is not sufficiently expansive to think that corporations will be willing to support higher taxes on themselves to support climate finance, if that was the gist of your question. So I think it's climate policy has, climate issues having trouble just getting countries to reduce their emissions, let alone changing their tax policies, particularly their non-carbon tax, their more general tax policies vis-a-vis corporations. So in my view, I guess, I don't think there are many countries in which climate politics would have sufficient prominence to affect corporate tax policies. So while I might agree with your premise of your question about whether corporations are paying their fair taxes, I think the issue, I think the climate issue by itself is unlikely to have a significant impact on corporate taxes. Now, there are a lot of proposals for carbon taxes. In some places have now adopted carbon taxes, and that could provide a dedicated stream of revenue that could be used for mitigation and adaptation purposes. But that's a separate kind of tax issue, I think. On the question, on the question of the Brazilian rainforest, so Paris, I guess, is because Paris allows countries to nationally determine what they do. Brazil is not violating any of its obligations under Paris, whatever it does to protect or not protect in this case, the rainforests. I guess in my view, your question raises a more general international law question, which is to what extent can countries impose sanctions on another country? A country imposing economic sanctions, the reason for imposing economic sanctions is not necessarily that the country upon whom the sanctions are imposed has violated international law. International law generally provides relatively few limits on economic pressure as a form of influencing other countries. So I guess in my view, if other countries want to try to exert pressure on Brazil by imposing sanctions, there's nothing international law says that either allows or disallows them. It basically is neutral on that question. It's neither that you have to impose sanctions or that you can't impose sanctions. I think international law is silent on that. So I think I covered the questions.
It's interesting that despite your best efforts, the perception is of you as being optimistic in this. Dr. Bhatt, I invite you to say so.
My name is J.R. Bhatt. I serve as advisor in the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. At the outset, I want to thank Navroz for arranging this kind of a talk, taking advantage of his presence, I'm sure, here in New Delhi. And on my own behalf and on behalf of the government, I would like to thank you and the brilliant speaker. Professor, I never met you face to face as I'm doing now, but I developed interest in your very meticulous and excellent work, scholarly work, starting from 1993, after the INCs that you had put up a paper on history of, which was briefly also said by one of the persons who asked question, in the history of the UNFCCC. And ever since then I have been, of course, certain of your works were difficult to source. So at the first instance, I would, with folded hands, make a request that also put me in your mailing list so that I can get access to that and also accept our admiration and appreciation of very high scholarly work that is being done by you and your unit. So we are not into that frame of thinking because this was largely an academic kind of a thing. So while we are winding up, let me give it a little bit of touch of negotiations. Mainly out of my curiosity, please discount any suggestion that I make if you don't like it or if it is considered very childish on my part to have asked that. But what makes you think that something like ocean report will fly in COP25? Because we have seen the fate of 1.5 report. India welcomed it and so on. There were countries who were trying to say that we would not welcome it. And 1.5 report was something commissioned by the parties, by the UNFCCC. And ocean report is, I believe it is within the own cycle of IPCC that has been. And also given the fact that these blue carbon ecosystems, they have a very limited potential. When mangroves, the xerophyte, corals, and these are on decline worldwide, at that time India is registering a steady increase in these ecosystems. We have been able to enhance by almost more than 158 square kilometers. And so is our forest. We have difficulties, but this is. So what makes you think that this could be a possible agenda item? That is, and these are just comments or suggestions you might not like to even answer, but we can discuss over a cup of tea later on if you have time. The other thing I was thinking was basically you said about the abandonment of the annexes from the Mother Convention, which remained a framework convention because at that time we were there also in the INC, so at that time there were reasons why it remained a framework, and we all know that. So what makes us say in a legal parlance that those are abandoned? Because after all, the protocol and the agreement flows from that mother framework. And also, where do we go from here, from Paris? Will there be new daughters or sons added? Protocols or agreements? And also, what's your general take on stocktake, the 2023, I believe? And also, if the world will move ever towards the adaptation target, because these are two sides of the same coin. If you don't do mitigation, you have to keep on increasing the adaptation burden. So while that is not happening, will world ever converge towards, like you have a mitigation target of at least 1.5 or 2 or whatever, the adaptation target. And lastly, who will benefit and who will disbenefit in the whole discourse? Because we heard people wanted to buy Greenland because newer possibilities were opening up. So, who benefits, who disbenefits? And the mess that we are in, because for youngsters, now the youth is increasingly getting engaged. And for youth, the future seems to be in a realm of conjecture. And when they look back at history, past is a very, what should I say? I don't have exact terminology, but in a blunt way, if I have to say, past is a kind of an act, collective act of a number of countries. It has put the whole world in a jeopardy, which we are not able to solve. We are thinking how to solve. And it's like an amoeba, it has ramifications so far and wide, where to start, where to begin. And though some countries are doing their best, how would this monster be cut, or will some countries start profiteering from such disasters in future? So these are some blunt thoughts, but ignore them, but keep me on your memory. And I really enjoyed your presentation, and the way it was such a complicated thing, as the other person who questioned also, Iman, made quite easy to understand, especially the kind of what is going to come in future, including this COP. So I would, say that this kind of, of course, my tongue was not rolling, but he rolled it faster and gave a word that keep doing this kind of very excellent work that you are already doing, and join me in giving him a big round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Would you like to answer the short thoughts for some of these points?
I don't know if I can end better than that, but so I'll just make a few not so eloquent observations in response to your questions. So I think on the oceans report, like the 1.5 degree report, there's the question as to what the COP does formally and what influences has more broadly. So in Katowice, they couldn't do much of anything in terms of formally endorsing the 1.5 degree report because the Conference of the Parties operates by consensus, so that allows a very small number of countries to be able to block adoption of resolutions or decisions that have otherwise very widespread support. So I think the same is going to be true of the oceans report. That's, I think, a general feature of the way the framework, the climate change regime works. But I think there's the question as to what the broader impact of these reports is. And I think the 1.5 degree report, even if though it wasn't formally endorsed by the Katowice conference, I think it's going to have a very big influence. It's already being discussed as being the benchmark for establishing what kind of emission reductions are necessary, 50% reduction by 2030, net zero by 2050. So I think in terms of the broader impact, the 1.5 degree report will have a significant impact. And I think with the oceans report, the same hopefully will be true, that even though it's not going to be formally endorsed, it might have a broader impact. Where do we go from Paris? So I guess I think essentially for the last 25 years, countries have been in a negotiating mode trying to work out, what the rules should be. I think the hope of some people, including myself, is that, Paris is about as good as we're going to get, at least in the near term, in terms of actually international rules. And so now the real task is implementation. So there should be less focus on constant negotiations and more focus on how to actually implement to make Paris work. And so I guess my hope is in the next 5 or 10 years, COPs will be less gigantic political events. There'll have to be political events every 5 years for these political moments after the stocktake, but the average COP will be a much more mundane meeting like most conferences of other treaties are, where they're focusing on implementing the existing treaty rather than negotiating a new treaty. So I guess I hope there isn't another agreement negotiated after Paris for a while at least. Let's see how Paris does. First, let's try to focus on implementing Paris, and then if it really doesn't succeed, then we'll have to go back to the drawing board. But until then, it's better to focus on the implementation side. I guess I hold relatively low expectations for the stocktake for the same reasons that you mentioned about the 1.5 degree report, because any decisions about the stocktake by the Conference of the Parties will require consensus. It's likely that the stocktake outcomes will be extremely watered down and weak, like the outcomes from the Talanoa dialogue, which was a predecessor to the stocktake. So I think the effect of the stocktake, hopefully, to the extent it has an effect, will be a broader effect that kind of thing that Navroz mentioned. It'll get countries to be focusing internally. So even if the formal results are modest, hopefully the process of preparing for the stocktake and doing the analysis for the stocktake will have broader ramifications, even if the outcomes are meager that the COP itself adopt. I guess an adaptation target, my view, maybe reflecting my country of origin, is mitigation and adaptation are quite different kinds of problems. And so I don't think it's I think it's appropriate that they're dealt with differently in the climate regime. I'm not sure what an adaptation target would look like, whereas I think it's clear what a mitigation target could look like. It could look in terms of temperature change, in terms of emissions, in terms of concentration levels. There's a lot of clear metrics that you could use for a mitigation target, but I guess I'm uncertain about, I'm open to ideas, but uncertain. I haven't figured it out myself as to what an adaptation target that would be analogous might look like. In terms of how will we be able to tackle the problem, that's of course the big question, and I have no good answer to that, but hopefully this process will succeed in generating some positive virtuous cycle. That doesn't mean I'm terribly optimistic, so don't get me wrong, but that at least is the hope. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Bodansky. Thank you all for speaking to this conversation. I think you all agree it's been a wonderful conversation. Somewhere between optimism and dire pessimism, I think we can find our way forward. And much of the Paris Agreement, this is sort of a long and somewhat winding road. Thank you for making that map for us to get there.
Thank you all for your attention.